it's John, and I'm back here today with Haydn Shaughnessy. Haydn's rejoined us to share a big idea about organizational design and creative destruction. Haydn, welcome back.
Hey, John. Nice to be here.
After we spoke, you wanted to add a few more comments because I think there really are some big ideas floating around in the zeitgeist these days about how to innovations thrive and how do organizations survive in a period which really seems to be thriving on creative destruction. What can you tell us about your thoughts on those subjects?
I think that the last 20 years, a lot of business literature has been absorbed by the idea of innovation. So if you go back to 2001, 2005, people started to talk about open innovation, and that became a more generic kind of thing around crowdsourced innovation. And since then, it's been a lot about innovating the business model. I think that's a pendulum effect is kicking in at the moment, because if you look back before 2000, we were always talking about the operating model. And so from 1980, say, to 2000, it's very much about global supply chains, or what we now call global value chains. And really the globalization of investment in productive capacity. And that was a huge, huge change, and a huge change that many, if not most, companies embraced. Since 2000, this pendulum swung towards business model innovation and open innovation, innovation ecosystems, those types of things. But I think that the pendulum is swinging back, and it needs to swing back towards the operating model. It's what some people call the target operating model, what I would call generative operating models. And the reason for it is, if you look at the last 20 years, you could even extend that to the last 30 years, we see an accelerated cycle of creative destruction. So let's go back to the last recession, or the Great Depression of 2008 onwards. Apple launched the App Store in 2008. Salesforce launched its defining SaaS platform in 2008. Android launched in 2009. A lot of the things, in fact, AWS, Amazon, started to come into its own around about that time as well. So a lot of the things that define the economy now began in 2008, during that recession. And it's one of the things that I wrote about in my book, The Elastic Enterprise, that these companies not only succeeded, but they succeeded beyond all expectations in the teeth of recession. If you go back to around about 2000, that dot-com bust and recession there, or 1993, 94, that recession, that gives birth to Amazon, Amazon.com. The early 1990s, well, that leads to the early days of Google. You know, many of the things that define the economy now come out of these moments of creative destruction, or what we at the moment might identify as recession. You know, we're about to face a recession. We're in a recession because of the pandemic. There was a recession in 2008, as there was in 1993. So all these indicate a very, very accelerated cycle of creative destruction. If you go back to the period before that, when we talked about creative destruction, we were talking about Generative waves. We were talking about 50-year cycles of creative destruction, Schumpeter, 50, 60-year cycles. We're now talking about 10-year cycles. It's really, really important, therefore, I think, for large organizations to start figuring out what kind of operating model allows them to adapt that quickly, to make fundamental change that often. And very often, it's not just one fundamental, several changes. The idea, or the concept that my partner Finn Goulding and I came up with around that, is to start talking about the generative operating model. So don't try and go from today's operating model to a target operating model that's kind of a fixed future. Think instead of a generative operating model. Think of an operating model as something that you constantly generate new ideas for, you constantly redesign, and you constantly grow your skills in. Because one of the big problems right now in transformation, we call it transformation, we should be calling it operating model design. All transformation is operating model design and redesign. We need to grow skills in that area and not keep seeing change as a kind of a giant episode of transition from one state to a future state. It's about designing the operating model, redesigning it and growing the skills to continually redesign it.
Some real food for thought there. Haydn, you are, as you mentioned, with your colleague and those you're collaborating with, doing some really important work to help bring together this type of thing. Do you want to say a few words about what we can expect from you in those months in 2021?
Well, we launched Transformation Sprint October 2020. And the idea of Transformation Sprint is that it is a tool for operating model design and redesign. Basically, what we're saying there is that the problems that companies face are so common and so much shared between different companies that you're wasting your money if you go to a major consultancy and spend $500,000 having your problems analysed. You can tick your problems off. We've provided checklists in the book. Most companies have similar problems, say 15 to 20 problems that they would share 10 of. So you can do that kind of analysis much more quickly than we've been used to. And that can kickstart a operating model redesign processes. So that's something that we're heavily involved in right now, getting companies to recognize that they don't need to spend a huge amount of time on operating model design and redesign. So that's one important area. Do we have other goodies in the bag? I think that this area of creative destruction is probably something that we're going to dive much more deeply into as the year goes by, because what we need to do is to get companies to recognize that this is a very, very difficult thing for them to recognize, but get them to recognize that the firm, the company, the corporation, the enterprise, call it what you will, is not a static entity. You tend to think of it that way because they've got org charts and they'll do reorgs, but essentially the organizational chart is a fixed entity with some adaptability in between, in the middle there. But what we've got to get companies to realize is that the role of senior people is actually this thing, this operating model design and redesign task, and get them to realize that they're not skilled at it, they don't have experience in it, but they do have to skill up.
It's interesting to hear you mention the concept of an org chart being something that's such a limitation for so many. I remember hearing the cliche, and I don't know who it comes from, but the idea that a startup really ceases to exist the day it institutes an org chart and a hierarchy. That's the death sentence. And actually, I was doing some research of my own, watching the Y Combinator podcast last week, and their host Craig Kent shared some really great insights about sharing insights from their community. And one of the things he said that was it was the question about what's something controversial that you think is really true and should be instituted in your community. And he said that tech corporate jobs in the Valley were actually stifling that entrepreneurial creative destruction because people got too comfortable in long periods at corporate jobs that became very rigid and lacked that type of dynamism. And he was promoting the idea that there should be something like a 5-year divesting in any company, that you move out if you don't continue to contribute after a period of time. And yeah, there's probably some smart strategies in organizational design that could enable that sort of thing that you're talking about, don't you think?
Yeah, I worked with a client going back a couple of years now who engaged with 2 or 3 fintechs. I think in total 3, but 2 were really critical to what they were trying to do in all design terms. The reason they'd engaged with them was because they wanted to get the kind of maverick behavior of the fintech into the culture of the organization. So they wanted to, as it were, leech that kind of characteristic. What they found over time, though, was the more they interacted with the fintech, the more conventional the fintech became. So it's like the more the fintech tried to ape the behavior of the executives on the other side of the table, because that was felt by the fintech to be where they should be headed. So yeah, I think that a lot of the value of startups is lost because of that kind of behavior. But look to China. Look to the speed of decision making there. There are reasons for it, and you can excuse Western companies for not being able to mimic what Chinese companies do. But I mean, because look, China's a growing market, massively growing, massively changing. So I think the middle class is officially measured now at 400 million people, which is, compared to America, 90 million, by the way. But 400 million people compared to what 10 years ago, 50, 60 million, compared to negligible amounts 20 years ago. Those are guesses, but 400 million is a huge number of middle-class people. So you can fire up new business propositions and start trying them out very, very quickly in the Chinese context. I remember listening to one of the executives at Alibaba talk about the launch of their travel service. So they were doing a kind of an e-flight, a flight booking system. And it began with a conversation between three or four of the execs. And the decision-making process was something like, why not? Let's give it a go. Let's see what happens. And being able to do that, and of course that's the big Bezos thing as well, isn't it? As long as you can walk back through that door, as long as once you've gone through that door, you're not trapped on the other side and can't undo what you've done, then you should try it. And I think Chinese companies are very much of that view that in a growing economy, in a dynamic economy, you might as well just try it. I wonder how many companies right now with the COVID problem, the COVID recession to come, say around about June, June's going to, that recession, although the IMF is saying there's going to be a bounce back, you have to doubt that. Some areas are going to go down and are going to be permanently damaged. But I wonder how many companies are thinking, yeah, we can do something substantially different here, and it'll be it'll be good for everybody. It'll be good for our young intake to see us being dynamic. It'll bring new leaders on a little bit. There's so many advantages in launching a new initiative. One that I was really impressed by, I read about it in the Financial Times over the weekend, was that during the recession, during the pandemic, Instagram has launched a thing called the Artist Support Fund. I think it's called the Artist Support or the Artist Support Pledge or something like that. Essentially what they're doing is allowing artists to sell for free on Instagram, as long as the product is under $200, and as long as for every 5 products they sell, they buy one. That's an ingenious way of generating market activity for a group that has suffered disproportionately in the pandemic. Great. Give it a try. What does it do? What it actually does is it starts to line Instagram up as a competitor to eBay. It's fantastic. So I wonder how many other companies out there are thinking that way right now. What can we do that makes, or primes us for a significant shift?
I don't know if you would see it the same way, but it reminds me a little bit of how I recall the case for Level 39 being created by Canary Wharf Group was to attract, the tenancy was declining in the financial district there. FinTech seemed to offer some promise, and it could also offer a chance to experiment with startups and a new audience, and that was a way to also attract energy, bring in new customers, and see activity in their community grow along the way. So, yeah. Sometimes looking at things differently can add some value.
Yeah, we have to say that during that time that Level 39 launched, there were a lot of incubators being launched around the world. It was hardly radical. I did think that Swift did some good things in that period, but Level 39 wouldn't be one I would necessarily call out. Now, I have a note here somewhere. If you don't mind me just consulting one of my documents, I could tell you a little bit more. But I was trying to get examples earlier on today of companies that are doing significant pivots. AirAsia has moved into remittances. Kind of logical adjacency, isn't it? If you're no longer able to fly planes, move money. They've also moved into food delivery, which could end up being a bit of a mistake, actually, but there it is. Let's see who else we've got.
I'll admit that's highly innovative by comparison. So kudos, you got me.
Yeah, well, I just was collecting these things earlier on, and I collected a few around 2008. Elon Musk over as CEO of Tesla, 2009. No, it took over in 2008, and the first Tesla car came off the line in 2009. The App Store launched, Android launched its first phone in 2009, Salesforce launched Force.com 2008. I'm just trying to make the point about this cycle of creative destruction and speed. These are defining companies, not just any old company. Oh, would you disagree?
No, absolutely. Those are great examples of defining companies.
Yeah, all 2008.
And why do you think there's that intimate link between the trough of the crisis and these champions being born then?
I think it's really, really about, incumbents don't respond to adverse conditions particularly well. They hunker down, they cut costs, It's one of the big things of the pandemic, and one of the early things that happened, of course, is workforce reduction. So this kind of reaction of conventional companies to go into hibernation, almost, at least to go into quite radical cost saving, that takes a lot of effort as well. You're effectively waving goodbye to a lot of people, but you're doing that at a time that's critical to their lives. There's a lot of emotion, a lot of negativity generated by that kind of thing, a lot of fear generated by it. That's the kind of atmosphere that people are potentially creating during the pandemic. People are already stressed enough, but they're in danger of losing their jobs. The response of companies like Salesforce and Apple, Tesla was 180 degrees the opposite. Let's grow.
They responded to real need and created something that had real value. We talked a moment ago about one example of sort of an accelerator with Level 39 and the fact that there are many others out there. And also with what you've been talking about with the ideas of creative destruction and perhaps some of the contradictions of startups working with corporates and how that can stale their mojo. What do you think actually works when it comes to creating new types of opportunities where those worlds meet in open innovation? Is something like an accelerator a practical idea, or are there maybe better ways to think about harnessing the energy that's coming out of the old industry and into a new burgeoning startup activity?
One of the things that you notice in the startup world is the extraordinary failure rate. I think that the financial sector has done really well to cultivate a FinTech ecosystem. But I haven't seen anybody say that that's changed the failure rate. 95% of startups fail. 74% of those fail when they try to grow. And I think the lesson of Silicon Valley is it takes generations of failure or generations of experience, generations for experience to grow. So I don't believe there's much you can do in the space of the 10 years or even less that the FinTech community has been around. Again, if you look at the guys that, just thinking about my phone, my Android, I used to have an Android phone. If you look at the guys that started Android, they began in the operating system world in 2000 with BE OS. So BOS was an attempt to take on Microsoft and Apple operating systems. So there's this feeling in the tech community that the operating system world was dominated by two people. That was wrong. And a few people left Apple and said, we'll set up B. And a bunch of people joined them from different areas to try and create what they thought was an operating system for the internet. Somewhat misguided, somewhat off the mark, but it gave a whole generation of engineers and entrepreneurs experience in developing the operating system for technology devices and building business cases for those devices. They went on to power Palm Pilot. They went into Palm and initially made Palm more successful. And they went into Android, of course, and eventually became Google Android and became extraordinarily successful and dominant. So it actually takes this kind of process. I'm absolutely convinced that all disruption and all counter disruption, all these experiences take a minimum of 15 years just to mature, because you need a generation or two of people that have gone through the mill.
Do you think there are ever cases, I remember, speaking of mobile handsets and things like that, I remember reading a case once of Ericsson's demise and the impact that had on the community around Helsinki, I think it was. And there was a unique fund made, a little bit like what you're describing Instagram had done, except it was an employment fund that offered an option of an entrepreneurship route to some of their programmers and hardware developers who were leaving Ericsson at the time, I think it was, or pardon me, it might have been Nokia at the time, excuse me. And they moved on to create a mobile app community there. Are there more rapid cases, or was that another one where it had been a long time coming and there were waves of development before that?
Well, any mobile app community had a long history in apps for things like the Mac. That's why the App Store could succeed. Long before the App Store, there were tens of thousands of apps around. So there's a long history there. I think an interesting example is here. which is the Nokia, what was the Nokia mapping solution. So here was an acquisition, wasn't called here at the time. It was a Nokia acquisition in the mid-2000s. Forget what Nokia did with it, because obviously Nokia imploded and there were very many unfortunate elements of that implosion. But here is now owned by BMW. And what BMW have done with it is opened it to a consortium of major companies like tyre manufacturers, other car manufacturers, Mercedes, a member of that. And what they're trying to do is create an ecosystem out of the mapping software. It's very interesting because ordinarily we think about the ecosystem functioning at the level of the app developer community or the content community or the points of interest community. And no doubt those things will grow. They will be important as well. But to develop an ecosystem at this other level, say, for example, you invite in air hauliers, aircraft, long haul companies or building operators. You can start to map out the inside of buildings. You can start to give people the ability to find where they're going to inside buildings. That's one of the things they're trying to do at the moment. There's a huge number of things that become possible and desirable because you bring a consortium or an ecosystem together at that level. Now, I've gone off your original point a little bit because that's deliberately so, because I don't believe that app communities are necessarily the most dynamic element in these transformations. But I think certainly in mapping, you have an example there of something that in public, we only think about Google Maps. We tend not to think about any alternative to that, but actually here powers Facebook, as far as I'm aware. So under the surface, this Nokia implosion has actually generated a lot of new capability in location-based services. So BMW powers its parking solutions from here. It builds payment solutions, parking payment solutions on top of those parking solutions based on here. So a lot of things start to get built on top of that platform. But you can trace it back to Nokia, the mobile phone, and competition with Google, and all the sad things that happened in the 5 or 6 years after that acquisition, thankfully have come good in a different context.
I get the sense that this comes down to rewriting some first principles about assumption of stability is constant flexibility, and then also what are the new tools that you need to navigate in a radically different assumption about how things are operating. Is that fair to say when we boil it down to what people can do to somehow manage that type of an environment?
Well, what we're trying to say in Transformation Sprint and what we do with the consulting work, Phil and I, is to focus on this generative operating model. If you go and hire a consultant to plan your transformation, they will give you a lengthy description of where you're at and an even lengthy description of where you've got to go to. And your transformation is the journey from A to B, A to Z, actually. So that kind of thing has demonstrably not worked. It's now, I think, a decade where we've had this data around that the majority, up to 80% of transformations fail to meet expectations. So you've got to do something. You can do it the same way, the same result. And one way to do it differently is to think about this generative operating model. What are the components of my operating model, and where can I generate progress, improvement, transition in those elements? And those elements might consist of things like, for example, value discovery. We focus on 3 top-line elements of the model, generative operating model: value discovery, value management, value delivery. And value delivery would be things like DevOps, so you're now doing continuous integration and continuous delivery. Value management would be things like portfolio management, which most companies do poorly and need to transition their techniques and tools. And value discovery is the innovation process. Again, most companies no longer invest substantially in innovation. There was research recently which highlighted the fact that most Western economies suffer an innovation deficit because large companies have disbanded their R&D departments. They've disbanded those kind of customer insight elements of it, the anthropologists, philosophers, sociologists and other anthropologists who used to have a feel for how society was changing and how that change could be reflected in new product lines. They've gone. Those kinds of things have gone. So it means that very often what passes as innovation systems, the innovation model of a company, will be things like fail fast, fail cheap, or lean startup. It basically be things like, if I could summarize it in one sentence, be let's chuck a load of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. That's an innovation system these days. You have to go back to first principles there as well, and say, actually, there was a lot of value in what these old R&D departments did. There was a lot of value in those sociologists, anthropologists, and philosophers, and all the other people that used to think about the future. How can we revive that? How can we actually revive genuine, deep insight into change, rather than saying, we'll just try a number of small projects and see what works? So that's operating model stuff. It's things like value discovery, value management, and value delivery. There are other elements which I think are absolutely contingent on the pandemic. It's things like, has the pandemic shown that global value chains leave us too vulnerable and exposed? So does it build a case, in fact, for relocalization? That is actually also an operating model decision that companies have to make. They've already made one during the pandemic, which is, we'll have people work remote. We are now a distributed company. So all the time you're actually talking about or puzzling over what are in effect operating model design choices. Do I relocalize? It looks like I may have to. It'll certainly reduce certain risks if I do. Do I go remote? Yeah, pretty much have to do that as well. My point is that these operating model choices are not being made at a conscious enough level in a way which allows you to keep an eye on your operating model. They're made in the moment and they're reactive. Far better that you take all the elements of the operating model, including location, value management, value discovery, value delivery, security, your ecosystem profiles, your overall capability profiles. Just put them all together on an A3 and say, what is it in there that we need to evolve? What skill sets do we need in order to evolve those things? What skills can we learn quickly enough to evolve them really, really well? That operating model, that generative operating model, just makes a ton more sense than the transition from an as-is to a to-be or existing state to a target operating model.
Yeah, COVID certainly has not only pushed the pendulum maybe back swinging another direction, but opened up a few cans of worms about other changes that could be making all this even more complicated. So nice to be getting down to first principles that we can guide ourselves with, and as well some of the tips you've laid out. Are there any final points, Haydn? I don't want to overwhelm people with this because it is a process that we want to come back to time and again, and we'll of course have you back to say more. But any final words you want to share today?
I don't think I have got any final words to say, because I said it all on the previous time we were talking.